Welcome back to the Deep Dive. If you are tuning in today, I am going to go out on a limb and guess you aren't looking for the standard, sugar-coated narrative.
Right, you want the actual mechanics of how things work.
Exactly. You are probably what we call the learner, someone who suspects that the history books used in schools are at best a highlight reel, and at worst, a complete fabrication designed to keep you compliant.
Yeah, you want to know how the machine actually operates.
Right, how civilizations are really built, how they survive, and more importantly, how they die.
And today we are looking at a death, but also a birth. It is a really complicated, brutal story.
It really is. We are stripping the paint off a subject that everyone thinks they know, Hawaii. Now, when I say that word, you probably think beaches, you think Mai Tais, you think relaxation.
You think of a soft, welcoming paradise.
Right. But we have a stack of research here today centered around a new ebook that is absolutely tearing up the charts in independent circles.
Yeah.
And it suggests that image is, well, basically a lie.
A total fabrication, yeah.
The book is called History of Hawaii: Prehistory, Ancient Times, European Contact, and U.S. Statehood. And it's written by Conrad Riker.
Riker is a fascinating character to dive into. He is not an academic in the traditional sense. He isn't sitting in a faculty lounge worrying about tenure or offending someone.
Not at all.
He writes like an engineer looking at a collapsed bridge. He wants to know the physics of the failure, and he frames this book explicitly as a red pill for history.
That is the exact vibe I got immediately. He actually calls it an antidote to revisionist guilt, which is a strong statement.
Very strong.
Now, before we dive into his arguments, if you're the kind of listener who wants the unvarnished truth about how institutions rise through strength and fall through soft ideology, do us a quick favor, hit that like and subscribe button.
It really helps us keep bringing you this kind of independent analysis.
It does. But getting back to Riker, he is pitching this almost as a field manual, isn't he?
He is. He is arguing that Hawaii is the perfect case study.
Yeah.
Because it is a closed system, it's totally isolated.
Right out in the middle of the Pacific.
Exactly. So you can see the variables clearly. You can see what happens when a society is run by hyper-masculine survivalist imperatives, and then you can see exactly what happens when those imperatives are eroded by what he calls the feminization of leadership.
Now, I want to be crystal clear right off the bat for our listeners.
Yeah.
This deep dive is going to be heavy.
Oh, yeah. We are getting into some intense territory.
We are talking about biology, violence hierarchy, and the really uncomfortable reality of power. Now, we want to stress that we are just analyzing the source material here.
Right. Our job is to unpack Riker's claims neutrally. We aren't endorsing the politics. We are just breaking down the data he presents.
Exactly. But if you are tired of being told your natural instincts are toxic, well, this analysis is specifically targeted at that mindset. But listen, we're only going to scratch the surface of the data Riker has compiled today.
Oh, yeah. He has 17 chapters of charts, genealogical records, economic data. It is dense.
So if this resonates with you as we go through it, open a new tab right now. Go to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books and buy History of Hawaii by Conrad Riker. You really need the full text to understand the blueprint he is laying out.
Because the data is what separates this from just another opinion piece. Riker really brings the receipts.
So let's start at the beginning. Section 1, Riker calls it the biological imperative. And he starts by just demolishing the Pacific Paradise myth.
Totally tears it down.
I think most of us had this image of the first Polynesians kind of drifting on a raft, playing a ukulele, and just sort of bumping into a tropical island where the coconuts just fall into their lap.
Right, that is the Disney version. Riker actually calls it the tourist brochure lobotomy.
The tourist brochure lobotomy, that's a great phrase.
His starting point is the ocean itself. He says we have to understand the sheer scale of the Pacific. These men navigated 2,000 miles of open water.
Which is insane to think about.
With no GPS, no compass, no sextant. And they weren't on a cruise ship. They were on double-hulled canoes exposed to the elements, dealing with swells that could crush them in seconds.
He has a line in the first chapter that actually made me laugh out loud, but it is dead serious. He says navigating 2,000 miles without instruments required balls of titanium, not committee meetings.
It is a funny line, but let's look at the evolutionary psychology behind it that he outlines. Riker's argument is that this voyage was a filter, specifically a genetic filter.
Right, because there's zero margin for error.
Exactly. You couldn't have a captain who was unsure. You couldn't have a navigator who relied on consensus or feelings. If the navigator was wrong about the star path, everyone died.
Just starved to death in the middle of the ocean.
Yep. If the steersman was weak when a storm hit, everyone died. So the people who actually stepped foot on Hawaii 1,500 years ago weren't just average people.
They were anomalies.
Right, they were the apex survivors of the human race at that time. It is survival of the fittest in its absolute purest form.
And he backs this up with hard science. He brings up the Makawahī cave data, which honestly I'd never heard of before reading this book.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating archaeological site over on Kauai. Researchers analyzed the skeletal remains found there to understand the daily life of the pre-contact Hawaiians.
Okay, and what did they find?
They looked specifically at healed fractures, broken bones that had mended over time, and they found that male skeletons showed 37% more healed fractures than female skeletons.
37% more. Okay, so let's play devil's advocate here for a second. Because a modern sociologist or a standard academic might look at that statistic and say, well, look at this toxic, violent patriarchy. These men were abusing each other, or the society was inherently oppressive to men.
Right, that would be the standard victimhood lens that you see a lot today. But Riker completely flips that interpretation. He calls it danger discrimination.
Danger discrimination.
Yeah.
Break that down for us.
He argues that in a tribal society living right on the razor's edge of survival, men act as the buffer. They're essentially the immune system of the tribe.
Right.
So those fractures aren't signs of oppression, they are signs of utility.
Utility. That is a very clinical way to look at it.
Well, think about where those fractures actually come from. They come from testing reef passages in heavy surf. They come from wrestling 200-pound ahi tuna into a wooden canoe.
Or tribal warfare.
Exactly. Riker's point is that the men purposely took on the roles with a high probability of death so that the women didn't have to.
Because according to the book, women are the reproductive bottleneck.
Yes. This is basic biology, which Riker hammers home repeatedly. If a tribe loses 10 men, the remaining men can still impregnate the women, and the population bounces back in a single generation.
Right, the reproductive capacity of the tribe hasn't actually dropped.
But if you lose 10 women, that is 10 incubators. And Riker apologizes for being crude, but he says that is the biological reality. Those are gone. The tribe's future potential shrinks permanently.
So the society naturally evolved to place men directly in the path of destruction.
Exactly. Riker has a quote for this. He says, "When the stakes are extinction, you bet on Darwin."
You bet on Darwin. Man, he does not pull punches. And he uses the division of labor to prove it wasn't just random acts of violence, right?
Yeah, he points out that men did the deep sea fishing. Why? Because the open ocean is incredibly treacherous. If a squall hits you, drown.
Right.
Women did the inland agriculture, the kapa cloth making.
Which is hard, physically demanding work.
It is hard work, yes. But a taro patch isn't going to kill you. A shark might. A rogue wave definitely might.
And he brings in genetic data to support this bottleneck theory, too.
He does. He cites studies looking at mitochondrial DNA versus Y chromosomes in the modern Hawaiian population. The lineage shows about 30 founding females for every 15 founding males.
Wait, let me stop you there. So twice as many women successfully pass on their genes compared to men?
Yes. And Riker's interpretation is crucial here for the men listening. It implies that historically, female reproduction is largely a default. Most women reproduce. But for men, it is a tournament.
A tournament.
A brutal one. Only the top 50%. The most competent, the strongest. The ones who survived the voyages and the wars actually got to become ancestors.
And the rest.
The rest died or were just outcompeted. Riker argues this created a lineage of men who were hyper-competent. They were the ultimate winners of a brutal genetic lottery.
Okay, so you have this population of elite survivors. They land on these isolated islands, and they don't set up a democracy. They don't set up a peaceful commune. They set up the kapu system.
The kapu. Now, if you learn about this in school, is usually taught as just religion. Taboos, don't eat this, don't touch that.
Great, just arbitrary rules.
But Riker reframes the kapu completely. He calls it a constitution and a resource management system that was enforced by absolute terror.
Terror seems like the exact right word based on the book. I mean, some of these laws were insane by modern standards.
They do seem insane if you view them through the modern lens of individual rights, but Riker asks us to view them through the lens of collective survival. For example, if a commoner accidentally casts his shadow on a high chief in Aliyah, the penalty was death.
Just for a shadow. And usually an immediate death, right?
Oh, yeah. Not a gentle death either. Often they were clubbed, strangled, or had their lungs crushed on the spot.
Which, again, sounds like madness. Why would they do that? Is it just because the chief is a narcissist?
Riker argues no. He says it is about the preservation of mana, which is spiritual authority and power. In a strict caste system, the hierarchy must be absolute.
You can't have cracks.
Right. If you allow the commoner to touch the chief's shadow, you are implicitly saying the hierarchy is permeable, that they are somewhat equal.
And if the hierarchy dissolves, order dissolves.
Exactly. And on a resource-scarce island disorder, it doesn't just mean a bad economy, it means famine and total war.
So Riker looks at this as inequality as order.
Precisely. And he points to the skeletal evidence again to back this up. This time from Moku'ula, they found that lower-class males had 60% more trauma injuries than the chiefs.
50%.
This wasn't a society where everyone held hands around a fire. The chiefs were biologically larger. They were better fed, they were selectively bred for size, and they physically enforced the law.
It is really interesting because Riker essentially defends this system. He doesn't say, oh, how terrible this was. He says it worked.
He says it worked perfectly for 1,000 years, the population grew steadily, the massive fish ponds were built, the complex taro patches were engineered.
And he compares this ancient system to MAGA corporate hierarchy versus cancel culture.
Yeah, he does.
Explain that parallel for a minute, because I think that is where the target audience for this book is really going to nod along.
So Riker says ancient Hawaii was intellectually honest. If you broke the protocol, if you threatened the order, you were physically killed. It was a physical removal from the tribe.
A permanent removal.
Right. Today, he argues, we have cancel culture. If you say the wrong thing, if you cast your shadow on the current ideological orthodoxy, you are socially and economically killed.
You lose your job.
Yep.
You are deplatformed.
Exactly. Riker's point is that we haven't actually evolved past the Kapu system at all. We have just made it passive-aggressive and hidden behind screens. The ancients were at least honest about the physical price of maintaining order.
That is a really chilling way to look at it. But honestly, it makes a kind of dark sense. Hierarchy is inevitable. The only question is just how you choose to enforce it.
And who gets to sit at the top of it? Which brings us perfectly to the Naha Stone.
Oh man, the Naha Stone prophecy.
Mm-hmm.
This is pure alpha male mythology, but Riker treats it as a genuine biological signal.
The legend was that whoever could overturn this massive volcanic rock, and we are talking about a rock that weighs 9,000 pounds, whoever could move it would conquer all the islands.
And Kamehameha, the future king, actually overturned it.
It did. Now, Riker points out he doesn't care if Kamehameha used a clever lever system or if he was just incredibly strong. The point is the symbolism of the act itself.
Right.
Leadership in this society was tied directly to physical capability, to high testosterone.
And the book links this directly to risk-taking behavior in leaders.
Exactly. Riker cites modern endocrinology studies. High testosterone strongly correlates with risk tolerance. To unite a chain of islands that had been violently at war for centuries, he didn't need a mediator.
You didn't need an empath.
No, you needed a man who looked at a 9,000-pound rock and said, I can move that. You needed a man who looked at the ocean and said, I can own that.
Which is the perfect segue into Section 2, the unification. Kamehameha the Great. Riker portrays him as the ultimate archetype of what he calls the builder-protector.
He is absolutely the hero of this book. And he is the hero specifically because he completely refused to compromise. Unification wasn't some diplomatic process with treaties. It was a brutal conquest.
Riker calls it conquest over consensus.
Right.
Let's talk about the actual methods he used, because this wasn't just guys throwing spears and swinging wooden clubs anymore.
Not at all. Kamehameha was a ruthless pragmatist. When Western ships started arriving, he didn't hide from them. He didn't cry about cultural appropriation or imperialism.
He saw the cannons.
He saw the cannons and he saw the muskets, and he immediately said, I want those. He traded sandalwood. In fact, he essentially exhausted his own forest just to get British weaponry. He adopted the superior technology instantly.
And then he used it at the Battle of Nuuanu.
This is the pivotal moment of Hawaiian history, 1795. On Oahu, Kamehameha lands his massive fleet, and he pushes the opposing army back up the Nuuanu Valley.
Now, if you have ever been there as a tourist, it is a really steep, narrowing valley that suddenly ends in a cliff. The Paleo Lookout.
It is a sheer 1,000-foot drop.
Yeah, it's terrifying just looking over it.
Riker describes the scene vividly, the deafening noise of the British cannons which the Oahu warriors had never faced before, the blinding smoke, the absolute panic.
And Kamehameha didn't offer them a chance to surrender.
He didn't. He pushed them, literally pushed them. Hundreds, maybe thousands of men were forced over the edge of that cliff to their deaths.
It is a massacre, just a slaughter.
It is. And Riker asked the really hard question here, was it worth it?
And what's his answer?
He points out that unification cost 40,000 lives over the course of his campaigns. That is a massive percentage of the population at the time, But what was the result?
Peace.
Peace. For the first time in history, a man could walk from one end of the island chain to the other without being killed by a rival chief. Commerce could actually flow.
He calls it Darwinism in loincloths.
He argues that softness meant extinction. If Kamehameha hadn't unified the islands with that level of brutality, the Russians, the French, or the British would have just picked them off island by island.
Right, divide and conquer.
A unified kingdom under a strong warlord was the only thing that kept Hawaii sovereign for another century.
He also brings up this concept of strategic hypergamy. Now, usually in these circles, we hear that term regarding women trying to marry up in status. But Riker applies it to a man to Kamehameha.
Yes, his marriage to Kitchulani. She was the highest-ranking chiefess in all the islands. Her bloodline was considered far more sacred than his own.
Right, he was from a slightly lower noble tier.
So by conquering her people and then taking her as a wife, he didn't just win the physical war. He won the genetics. He locked in the divine right to rule for his children.
Riker compares this to a hostile takeover in the corporate world, followed by a merger to secure the intellectual property.
It's a great analogy. And he actually compares Kamehameha directly to Elon Musk, doesn't he?
He does. He draws a straight line between the ancient warlord and the modern high-testosterone CEO. Men like Musk or Jeff Bezos.
They are often criticized today for being toxic rice, for driving their employees too hard, for being ruthless competitors.
But Riker's argument is that you don't build a kingdom or a reusable rocket company by being nice.
You do it by being effective. He explicitly contrasts this with the modern empathetic leader who worries about everyone's feelings and ultimately ends up tanking the stock price because they lose sight of the mission.
So we have the rise of the kingdom, built on blood iron and biology, but then comes the fall. And this brings us to section 3, the cap.
This is where the tone of the book noticeably shifts. It goes from admiration to deep frustration. Riker calls the arrival of the Christian missionaries the Trojan horse of religion.
So he is definitely not buying the saving souls narrative.
Not even a little bit. He views their arrival as a calculated psychological assault on traditional male authority, and he says it starts with the 1819 burning of the idols.
Now, this is a complex historical event, but essentially, the old religion of the Kapu was abolished by the Hawaiian leadership itself.
Yeah.
Specifically, Queen Kahamanu and the young King Kamehameha II.
Yes, and Riker calls this the destruction of the warrior ethos.
Why does he say that? If they chose to do it themselves.
Because the old gods like Ku were war gods. They demanded sacrifice. They demanded extreme physical rigor.
Yeah.
When you burn the idols, you aren't just changing your faith. You are signaling to the population that the era of the warrior is officially over.
And into that power void step the Calvinist missionaries from New England.
And they bring a very different kind of software to run the society.
They bring a software of guilt.
Exactly. Riker points out that the missionaries replaced the physical death penalty for breaking taboos with the psychological concept of internal sin.
Right, you shouldn't do this because it makes Jesus sad, essentially.
Riker argues this is a covert way to control men psychologically. It is soft power. You don't need a massive sheaf with a wooden club to keep order if you can make the man police himself through internal shame.
And then comes the land heist. The Great Mahile. I have to say, this part of the book really got my blood boiling.
It should. It is documented as one of the greatest swindles in modern history. The missionaries convinced the king that to be recognized as a civilized nation by the West Hawaii needed private property laws.
Right, because the old system was communal stewardship. The Ahuba system.
So they instituted the Mahile, the division of land. But here is the aggressive catch. To claim your ancestral land, you had to officially file paperwork.
Paperwork. In a culture that was entirely based on oral tradition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the paperwork was often in English or required a level of legal literacy that only the mission-educated elite possessed.
It's a rigged game.
Riker defines competence in the specific era as assimilation. If you refused to learn the white man's language or his legal system, you were legally deemed incompetent to own the very land your ancestors had farmed for 500 years.
And the statistics on women here are staggering. Riker really highlights this to make a specific point.
He highlights this to show that the Western patriarchy brought by the missionaries was actually far more oppressive to women than the indigenous Hawaiian system.
Right.
Pre-contact Hawaiian women held significant power and land rights. But after the Mahile, female land ownership dropped from roughly 40% down to 5% by 1840.
40% down to 5%. That is a massive, incredibly rapid dispossession of wealth.
It is. And look at who directly benefited from this new system. He brings up Reverend Richard Armstrong. a missionary.
A guy who preached poverty and humility.
Yet he somehow ended up personally owning 12,000 acres of prime Hawaiian real estate. Riker loudly calls out the hypocrisy here. He says it was never about saving souls, it was about acquiring hard assets.
He uses the phrase cultural castration for the broader social changes they forced on the population.
He lists the indignities one by one, banning hula because it was deemed lewd. But hula was their history book, it was their physical training matrix. It was literally like burning the National Library.
And then the clothes. Forcing Hawaiian men who were used to working in the tropical breeze into heavy wool suits.
In Hawaii, in the 1800s. Just absurd.
Riker notes that this actually caused serious health problems. Heat exhaustion, severe skin diseases.
But the missionaries didn't care about the physical bodies of the men. They only cared about the appearance of civilization. They wanted these Pacific warriors to look like docile New England accountants.
And the language shifts too. Riker points out how they translated the word aloha in legal documents. They translated it to charity.
That is a subtle shift, but Riker argues it is incredibly powerful. Aloha implies equality. It is a shared breath. Charity is strictly top-down.
Right, it implies a beggar and a wealthy giver.
Exactly. It completely rewires the brain to accept a state of dependency.
But there was another group of white men out there in the islands at the same time. The whalers. And interestingly enough, Riker actually likes them.
He calls them the Iron Men. Riker respects the whalers because they were honest about their intentions. They were there purely for profit.
They weren't trying to save anybody.
Right. They faced brutal death every single day, chasing leviathans in tiny wooden boats. They were masculine. They weren't trying to change the Hawaiian soul. They just wanted to trade and blow off steam.
And party. They wanted to party.
Oh, they partied hard. And this brings us to what Riker calls the real economy and the story of Lydia Luce. She ran a massive brothel.
Now, the missionaries obviously saw this as the literal apocalypse.
But Riker looks at the actual ledger. He says whaling port towns were clearing $2 million annually on carnal needs and ship supplies.
$2 million back in the 1800s is billions today. It is massive revenue.
It absolutely fueled the entire economy. And women like Lydia Luce were brilliant entrepreneurs. Riker calls it adaptive entrepreneurship and the first venture capital in the Pacific. These women were taking the massive demand from these rough men and building real economic power. But the missionaries couldn't stand it. They fought the whaling industry tooth and nail, morally and legally.
And eventually, they replaced that economy with sugar.
And this, according to Riker, is the absolute death knell for the Hawaiian male. Whaling was dangerous, yes, but it was a true adventure. You could be a harpooner, you could rise to be a captain.
It rewarded competence and bravery.
But sugar is a plantation. It is repetitive, backbreaking, low-wage labor under a boss.
Right.
Riker argues the shift to the plantation economy created the masculinity void. Men were stripped of their ancestral role as the independent provider and turned into permanent dependence on a massive, faceless corporation.
Which leads us directly to the political collapse of the nation. Section 4, the overthrow. Riker calls this entire period a case study in failed pacifism.
It starts with the Bannett Constitution in 1887, King Kalakaua. Now, Riker says he was a good man, a true Renaissance man who genuinely tried to revive the dying culture.
But he made a fatal strategic mistake.
He borrowed heavily from the exact people who ultimately wanted his throne.
Riker has a great quote here. Sovereignty without economic control is theater.
That is the core lesson. The Honolulu Rifles, which was a private militia of white businessmen, literally forced the king to sign away his executive power at gunpoint.
And he couldn't fight back.
Because he didn't have the money to pay a standing army, and he didn't control the weapons. Riker says democracy delivered by coercion isn't democracy at all. It is just a slow-motion coup.
And then we get to Queen Liliuokalani in 1893. And this is where Riker's analysis gets really controversial, but also incredibly sharp regarding the underlying gender dynamics of power.
He argues that the overthrow wasn't primarily political, it was biological. Just look at the two opposing sides. On one side, you have the Committee of Safety, Sanford Dole, Lauren Thurston.
A pack of highly coordinated, aggressive males.
They were operating on the pure, ancient principle of might makes right. They wanted the land and they had the guns.
And the Queen. How does Riker analyze her response?
The Queen was operating entirely on honor. She believed in the moral high ground. She deeply believed that because she was the legitimate legal ruler, the United States government would step in, act fairly, and save her throne.
You can see that in her actual surrender statement. I yield to the superior force of the United States.
She thought that statement would somehow shame the U.S. into reversing the coup. Riker's analysis of this is brutal. He says gentlemen never bring tears to a knife fight.
Never bring tears to a knife fight.
He argues that she gambled the entire kingdom on sentimentality. She thought the world was fair. The Committee of Safety knew the world was only about force. Might makes right, and sentimentality gets monarchs deposed.
He really contrasts her decision-making with the Royal Guard.
Yeah, the Royal Guard consisted of roughly 500 trained men. They had Gatling guns. They were heavily dug in at the Iolani Palace.
They wanted to fight.
They were completely ready to die for the Queen. But Liliuokalani explicitly ordered them to stand down. She didn't want any bloodshed.
And Riker calls this the castration of a people.
Because by denying those men the right to fight for their nation, she broke their spirit completely. Imagine being a warrior ready to defend your home, and your leader tells you to just hand over your weapon and surrender without firing a single shot.
It destroys the masculine drive to protect.
Riker argues that a king, a Kamehameha-type figure, would have fought. They might have lost against the Americans, they might have all died, but they would have made the enemy pay a massive price in blood.
Right, they would have maintained their honor.
By surrendering peacefully, she signaled to the world that the Hawaiian people were no longer active players in the brutal game of power. They were now just subjects.
That leads us directly into the modern day. Section 5, the modern paradise. We are all living in the direct aftermath of that surrender.
Riker calls the modern tourist industry paradise packaging. Hawaii is sold to the rest of the world as a purely feminine product. The aloha spirit. Soft, welcoming, subservient.
But the reality underneath that packaging is very, very different.
The steed economy relies heavily on what he calls the plastic lei. A Boeing engineer actually did a calculation that Riker cites in the book. Every plastic lei sold to a tourist essentially funds about 3 seconds of the state budget.
3 seconds. It is a completely fragile, superficial economy. But his question is, who actually keeps the lights on? Who keeps the massive cargo ships moving?
Men. Working class men.
He calls them the invisible men.
Riker highlights the H2 power line repairs to illustrate this. Have you seen the footage of this? It is absolutely terrifying.
I haven't, no.
540 men dangling from helicopters, working on live high voltage lines over deep ravines and active volcanic vents. Just insane physical risk.
And he also mentions the molasses spill in Honolulu Harbor.
Thousands of tons of thick molasses spilled and sank to the bottom of the harbor. It was literally killing everything in the ecosystem. And who went down there to fix it?
Male divers.
Swimming in pitch black toxic syrup, risking getting permanently stuck and drowning just to clean up the mess. Riker's core grievance here is very simple. Society spends all day mocking toxic masculinity, calling men inherently dangerous.
But the second the toilet backs up or the power grid fails, they scream for those exact same men to come save them.
Exactly.
There's a statistic he pulled about Matson navigation that really stuck out to me.
Matson is the absolute lifeline of Hawaii. 90% of all goods come in by their ships. In a recent layoff round 0, women lost their jobs in the stevedore division.
And why is that?
Because unloading 40-ton steel containers on a swaying dock requires a level of grip strength and physical leverage that 90% of females simply lack biologically.
Riker uses this not to be malicious, but to state a cold biological fact. The bottom line of any economy is still physical reality.
And then he violently contrasts this reality with what he calls the consequences of equality. The tourism board story is a perfect example.
This reads almost like a comedy sketch in the book.
It really does. Riker describes a 2017 meeting of a state tourism subcommittee, which was mostly women. They spent 9 months, 9 entire months, debating the cultural appropriateness of hula costumes for a new marketing campaign.
9 months of committee meetings.
Meanwhile, in that exact same time period, a male-run submarine tour company executed a completely new marketing plan and seized 15% of the entire market share in just 18 weeks.
It is the stark difference between focusing on process versus focusing on outcome.
Riker argues that the feminization of our institutions leads to endless meetings, mandatory feelings checks, and total paralysis. The traditional masculine imperative is simple: identify, target, acquire, target, move on.
He also brings up the firefighters in Berkeley, California as a broader warning about this trend.
The Berkeley example is tragic. They purposefully lowered the physical fitness standards to achieve gender equity in the fire department. Riker cites the data on this. It directly led to more injuries on the job and arguably civilian deaths because the new equity hires physically couldn't drag a 200-pound unconscious victim out of a burning building.
He has a great line there. Physics is a patriarch.
Physics is a patriarch. Fire does not care about your diversity quota. If you literally cannot carry the heavy ladder, you cannot save the life. It's that simple.
And this societal loss of role, this feeling of being made obsolete, is literally killing young men today.
He connects fatherlessness and gangs directly to this. Riker links the rise of the Mawuka Boys gang in Wayane directly to the loss of the ancestral warrior role.
How so?
Young men possess a deep biological drive to be part of a strict hierarchy. They have an innate drive to face physical danger and prove their worth. If you take away the aha ceremony, the ancient rite of passage, where young men prove themselves by jumping into active lava tubes or cliff diving well, they don't just suddenly become peaceful accountants.
They find that danger elsewhere.
Exactly. Drugs, street gangs, violence.
It is a totally distorted modern version of the old warrior ethos.
They are desperately seeking validation. Riker argues that the current suicide epidemic among young Hawaiian men is fundamentally a crisis of purpose. These boys are the direct genetic descendants of master navigators and shark callers. And today they are being told their highest purpose is to politely fold towels at a luxury hotel.
It's soul-crushing for them.
It absolutely is.
So what is the fix? Because Riker doesn't just complain for 17 chapters. Section 6 is called The Way Forward. He actually offers a blueprint.
He does. He talks a lot about sovereignty, but he completely redefines the word. He says real sovereignty isn't asking the government for permission. It is presence.
The presence. He points to the Mauna Kea protests, right?
Yeah.
The TMT telescope standoff.
Riker is absolutely fascinated by this event. The Kiai, the native protectors, they didn't just file polite lawsuits in a rigged court. They physically blocked the access road.
Yeah.
The elders chained their own bodies to the cattle guards. They built a fully functioning village on the mountain. Riker says that is the return of the true masculine spirit, standing your ground physically. The state government literally didn't know what to do because they weren't used to men saying no and backing it up with physical presence.
And he draws a parallel to the Kahula bombing range occupation.
Back in the 70s, men like George Helm and Kimo Mitchell, they paddled over to the island illegally to physically stop the U.S. Navy from bombing it into dust.
They were called radical terrorists by the media at the time.
They were, and they ultimately died for it. They were lost at sea. But they won. The Navy bombing stopped. The island was eventually returned to the people. Riker's core lesson here is you don't get your land back by asking nicely. You get it back by becoming a physical problem the system simply cannot ignore.
He also stresses economic sovereignty as part of this blueprint.
He utterly hates the modern welfare state. He views state welfare as a calculated bribe designed to keep men weak, pacified, and dependent.
So what's his alternative?
He suggests establishing massive land trusts, similar to the Alaska Permanent Fund. The native people should legally own the hard assets and receive a shareholder dividend.
That entirely changes the psychology from I am a ward of the state to I am an owner.
Exactly. It restores dignity.
And he talks about language too. He calls it cognitive rewiring.
This is some of the deepest stuff in the book. Riker discusses the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the idea that the structure of a language shapes the speaker's thoughts.
So reviving Lelo Hawaii, the native language, isn't just about preserving a museum culture.
No, it is about learning to think like a conqueror ancestor again. He cites the Maori people in New Zealand as proof. Massive language revival programs there directly coincided with a 40% drop in youth suicide.
40%.
When a lost boy starts speaking the guttural language of his warrior ancestors, he naturally stands taller. His brain rewires for resilience.
Finally, Riker gives a very specific behavioral blueprint for the individual listener. His first rule, reject safe spaces.
He says the very concept of a safe space is literal poison to the male soul. The physical world isn't safe. The deep ocean isn't safe. You shouldn't be taught to hide from that danger. You should be trained to master it.
He says teach boys to spearfish again.
It sounds like a really specific hobby, but it is actually a profound metaphor for everything he is preaching. Spearfishing requires absolute silence, extreme focus, complete breath control.
You are hunting in an alien, terrifying environment.
You are physically inserting yourself back into the raw food chain. Riker says that kind of intense life or death focus cures modern ADHD better than any pharmaceutical pill. It grounds a man violently in reality.
And he ends with the image of the shark callers. The kahuna kamana.
This is the lingering image Riker leaves us with. Kamano was a man who could supposedly call wild sharks using specific stones clacked underwater. He intuitively understood the acoustic frequencies that the sharks responded to.
He didn't fear the apex predator.
He understood it. He deeply respected its power. And because of that competence, he could summon it.
Men working with nature's brutality, not hiding from it in an air-conditioned office.
That is the ultimate goal of the book, to reclaim that primal competence. To be the man who can navigate the deadly storm, who can engineer the fish pond, who can call the shark.
Societies thrive under male leadership and collapse without it. That is his final unapologetic thesis.
Hawaii is his warning to the rest of us. It perfectly shows what happens when you trade your heavy cannons for legal contracts and you trade your fierce warriors for soft warriors.
You lose your nation.
You lose everything. The book is the solution. It is a direct call to rearm the modern mind.
Look, we have been going for a long time today, but I have to tell you, the listeners, we missed about 80% of what is actually in this text.
Easily.
We didn't even get to talk about his controversial Pearl Harbor analysis. We completely skipped the brutal plantation riots of the 1920s.
There are detailed charts on the massive caloric intake of ancient warriors versus the diet of modern men that will completely blow your mind.
So if you want the full download, if you want the actual hard ammunition to win these arguments, and the blueprint to understand your own place in the modern world, you need to buy this book today. History of Hawaii by Conrad Riker.
It is available right now on Amazon Kindle. It is on Google Play Books. Don't just take our word for it. Go read the raw source material for yourself.
And for a daily dose of this exact kind of unfiltered thinking, the kind of stuff that is frankly too hot for mainstream platforms, you really need to follow the author directly.
You can find him at Conrad Riker on Substack. He posts daily. He calls it Spartan Tactics for Boardroom Battles. It is absolutely essential reading if you want to stay sharp.
You know what to do, guys. Like and subscribe to this deep dive so we can keep bringing you these intense, unvarnished breakdowns. And more importantly, take action in your own life. Don't just be a passive consumer of content. Be a learner. Be a builder.
Remember the ancient navigators? They didn't whimper when the sky grew dark. They sailed directly into the hurricanes.
Leader be led. Oh, and one last thought to leave you with before we sign off. If the Pacific Ocean was the ultimate genetic filter that forged these hyper-competent men, what happens now? What happens to that biological drive when the map is fully explored and all the frontiers are closed? If men don't have a physical ocean or a literal mountain to conquer anymore, does that unspent energy eventually turn inward and destroy the society from within? Or do we need to start building entirely new frontiers like space colonization just to give that masculine drive a place to survive, something to chew on?